Conflict is a storm for relationships and for life together in community. Today's gospel is paired with the prophet Ezekiel warning the wicked to turn away from their ways. And Paul reminds us that love is the fulfillment of the law. So whenever we gather in the name of Christ, we are assured of his presence here among us with the gifts of peace and reconciliation in the midst of whatever storms we may be facing. And as followers of Jesus the Christ, as children of God, people who are made in the image of our Creator, beloveds, this means that reconciliation is our faith family business. Reconciliation is our faith family business. Now, the Gospel of Matthew is sometimes called the church's manual. It's seen kind of as a how-to book by some. And it's likely that Matthew included this story because of the conflict going on in his own church, the gathering of believers that came from a Jewish background. Now, this isn't a surprise that there may have been conflict, because wherever there is community, there is conflict. And Jesus had to deal with it among his own disciples. And there are sinful and unproductive ways to deal with conflict or to avoid it. And thankfully, we hear this morning that there are also Christ-like ways to deal with conflict. Matthew 18 deals with conflict and has for centuries served as the church's model of conflict resolution, outlining a way for faith community health. If we respond to conflict without love, we've missed the whole point. In fact, some have pointed out that even this procedure could be misappropriated as a tool to wield power over and oppress others, using it as an excuse to bully those in and outside of the church. To use it this way completely misses the point of Jesus. Jesus gives us, and I don't usually fall to these little bullet points, but he gives us a 4-step process here in Matthew 18. And it's 4 easy steps to read, and it's 4 very difficult steps to live. We just heard them. If a member sins against you, go and talk to that person privately. If you aren't listened to, take 2 or 3 others along with you. If that doesn't work, the 3rd step is to take it to the church. And finally, if that doesn't work, treat that person as a Gentile or a tax collector. But this isn't how most of us or many communities function. It is completely countercultural. When someone sins against you, well, if you're like me, the last person you want to see or deal with is that person. And so instead of going to that person, I might tell someone else about it. I might whine and complain. I may speak ill about that person. So whenever someone sins against us, we have a tendency to go outside of that person and say, "Can you believe what he or she said or did? Isn't that offensive?" And we try and justify how we're feeling. And then that word gets out. It billows and builds storm clouds. And when we do this, we, of course, are creating a triangle. What was once a one-on-one conflict now involves others, and sometimes those storms of gossip rage outside of us and our community until everyone knows. It spins out of control, brought on by anger and drama. And now the offense might be quite real. It most often is. But now in the midst of this raging storm, we have less of a chance to resolve it. We've spread our conflict through the whole community like a hurricane spinning and reaching land God only knows where. Communities that function like this, individuals that function like this, couples and families and towns and organizations that function like this are constantly stressed with conflict. And we know from the outside looking in that there is not much well-being or health in a community that ignores or doesn't know how to handle conflict in healthy ways. That first step is the most important one. To go to that person privately. And when we do that, most of the time, reasonable people who love one another will be able to work through things. Equally important is that the community hasn't been dragged through the drama with them. And notice whose responsibility it is to initiate the conversation. Jesus says, if a member of the church sins against you, the person wronged is the one who is called to initiate the action, because oftentimes the offender is clueless. They have no idea that they have been offensive. And Jesus understands that left unchecked, this resentment that we carry when we've been sinned against can easily turn into anger, and that anger can blow up and harden our hearts and turn us to hatred. Jesus says if a member listens to you, you have gained that member back. You see, the goal of the conversation is our faith family business. It is reconciliation. Our whole Christian life is about forgiveness and compassion and reconciliation. We're called to engage, not to humiliate, but to heal. How much does our world need to hear that and know that and see it modeled today? That's why Jesus says, go and talk alone. Deal with it one-on-one first. Think about it. Maybe you've been called into a meeting or an office or into the principal's office, and you have walked in thinking you're having a single conversation and there's a table full of folks. Usually we're in trouble at that point. So we put up walls and we get defensive, but when we meet one-on-one, when we're given that courtesy, it often opens our hearts and those of the one that we meet with. But sometimes storms rage nonetheless. Sometimes people can't or won't hear. Sometimes we are hard-headed, and other times we are blinded by privilege. We have stomped on others' feelings with ignorance, or they have stomped in ours, or worse, a brutal violence has been committed. When this is the case, they may not be able to hear. And we're not to give up. We should try again. But this time, take someone along with you. When two people are in conflict, a non-anxious third party can often bring stability and clarity to the situation. I know it's hard to believe, but I often have folks that come to me with a complaint about another. They come to me as children do to a parent saying, so-and-so did this to me, and you should go fix it. Or go punish them. Or just know that they're a rotten human being. And like a parent, I try not to be drawn into that. I ask the question that you have probably all asked. Have you spoken to them about this? And most of the time the answer is no. We do this because we are afraid. Or we do this because we tried it years ago and it just didn't work. That never works, Pastor Bill. And in these cases, a caring response is offered to them. And I offer to move from step 1 to step 2 and to go and accompany them. Because as Jesus points out, having witnesses means that there can be no he said, she said. Every word can be confirmed. And if most people responded to the one-on-one, we wouldn't need this step. But when we need it, most folks will respond to a caring conversation with a couple of people. But sometimes storms rage nonetheless, and there are situations that need extra care. To these, Jesus says, take it to the church. Take it to those in positions of authority. This doesn't mean to stand up in announcements and to share your complaint against one another. It means take it to those in authority. In our tradition, it means call your vestry member. Reach out to a warden. The system protects our leaders from having to arbitrate every single conflict. We encourage you to deal with it one-on-one and then to take 2 or 3, and then if that still doesn't work, then the vestry is here for you. this comes because if those steps don't work, that's what leadership is. We're called to accompany and to be a presence for others. But sometimes storms rage, nevertheless. These first three steps are going to get most folks. However, there are some conflicts that are so deeply entrenched, and some folk are so unwilling to bend that they cannot be resolved. There's some folk that just cannot let go of bitterness, and usually this bitterness has nothing to do with what's going on in the present, but it's deeply rooted in some hurt deep down, conscious or unconscious, that has happened to this person before. Sometimes this person cannot deal with a situation. And so if that person won't listen to the leaders, then they're to be treated, as Jesus says, as a Gentile or tax collector. Some people think that if none of the other steps work, that what Jesus is saying, that it's okay to vilify and ostracize that person, to shun them, to exclude them, to excommunicate them from the faith community. We take our understanding that for Orthodox Jews in Jesus' time, they were not allowed to speak to Gentiles or tax collectors. They were not allowed to touch them, to be anywhere near them, or God forbid, even make eye contact with them. But that's not what Jesus meant. If you remember the Gospels and the stories of Jesus, Jesus was always interacting with folks that, well, good churchy folk wouldn't want him to hang out with. Jesus hung out with Gentiles and tax collectors and sinners. You might recall it got him in a bit of hot water with the Pharisees and Sadducees, who complained that he hangs out with these folk. My God, he even eats with them. And I love the irony and the fact that this gospel is named after Matthew, a tax collector. We're called to name the sin, but we're also called to be in relationship, even if it can't be within a community, with those who cannot work well in community. Beloveds, when Jesus says to treat someone as a tax collector or a Gentile, he means to treat them with compassion. They may not be willing or able or capable to be a part of a faith community. But we, as followers of Jesus, are called to leave that door unlocked and open, even if it is just a little bit. We are called, as people of faith, to keep the light and the love of Jesus on for them. Remember, reconciliation is our faith family business. Now, are there times when this process doesn't work or shouldn't be used? Of course. There are exceptions to many, many rules. If someone is in physical danger from an offender, these rules, these steps, are ill-advised. If the offender has committed a crime, if they have committed murder or rape or physical abuse, then we are called not to follow these steps or go to the church authorities, but to go to the civil authorities, to go directly to those who administer discipline. I wouldn't ask a bruised or hurting, abused person to place themselves at risk, but appeal to that person to go to the civil authorities. And if they can't go alone, to offer to accompany them. And if they need the support of the church, to offer the support of the vestry. But not to put it in the weekly e-news or bulletin announcement, because justice sometimes becomes juicy gossip all too often. Beloveds, Jesus calls us to love one another. That could be every week's sermon. But this week, Jesus is calling us, giving us a gift of a process, calling us to take sin seriously, not to stick our heads in the sand or to ignore when others or ourselves have done ill, but to bring them to the cross, to bring them to Jesus, to the place of faith and forgiveness, and to work to do that, first individually and then with another. And then if that doesn't work, to call on your church leaders. Jesus calls us to not let our hurts storm and rage inside of us so that they spill out and wreak havoc and disaster in our relationships and in our communities. May we live in love. May we live out our call in our faith, family, business to be a people of reconciliation and peace.